She didn't look like a threat. That was the whole point. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Voss walked into the base cafeteria at Camp Pendleton on a Tuesday afternoon wearing plain civilian clothes, a gray hoodie, dark jeans, and worn-out running shoes. No rank insignia, no uniform, no weapon visible. Just a woman carrying a food tray, scanning the room for an empty table like she had nowhere important to be and nothing important to prove. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail. There were faint shadows under her eyes from 3 days of almost no sleep, which had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the debrief she had just finished in a closed room with 4 intelligence officers. Rachel was 34 years old. She had completed SEAL training, officially known as Bud S, at a time when almost nobody believed a woman would last past the first week. Most men didn't last past the first week. The dropout rate hovered somewhere around 80% no matter who showed up, no matter how strong they were, no matter how much they thought they were ready. Rachel hadn't just survived it. She had graduated ranked in the top 3 of her class, with an underwater knot-tying record that still stood. She had gone on to serve 2 combat deployments in classified locations, had participated in high-value target extractions, and had been awarded a commendation that she was legally not allowed to discuss at a dinner table. She was, by every measurable standard, one of the most dangerous people on any base she walked onto. But she didn't look like it, and in her line of work, that was the most valuable thing she owned. The cafeteria was loud the way military cafeterias always are: metal trays scraping, boots on linoleum, conversations that bounced between exhausted and rowdy depending on who had just come off what kind of shift. Rachel chose a corner table, set down her tray, black coffee, a turkey sandwich, and an apple she had no real intention of eating, and pulled out her phone to scroll through nothing in particular. She was tired. Her shoulders carried the specific kind of tension that doesn't come from physical exertion, but from sitting completely still in a cold room for hours, while people ask you questions about things you cannot fully answer. She had been on base only for the debrief. She wasn't assigned here. She was passing through, the way people in her world often pass through places, quietly, without announcement, without a paper trail that meant much to anyone who didn't already know where to look. Tomorrow morning she had a flight. Tonight she had a bed in the visiting officer's quarters and a meal she hadn't eaten yet. The 4 Marines came in as a group, loud before they even reached the food line. She noticed them without looking directly at them. That was a skill too, peripheral awareness, constant and automatic, trained so deeply into her nervous system that it happened the way breathing happened. She clocked their body language: young, high energy, the particular loudness of men who had recently been praised and were still riding the feeling. They were probably back from a successful field exercise, she guessed. There was something loose and triumphant in the way they moved through the room, drawing attention without trying to avoid it. They got their food. They looked for a table. The cafeteria was not full, but it was not empty either. There were open tables near the center and a few along the far wall. They chose the one right next to Rachel's. She didn't look up. The conversation started the way those conversations sometimes started, not immediately aggressive, just testing. One of them, a broad-shouldered lance corporal who sat closest to her, glanced over and made a comment to his friends, quiet enough to be deniable but loud enough that she was clearly meant to hear it. Something about civilians taking up table space. A small thing. The kind of small thing that is never actually small. Rachel took a sip of her coffee, said nothing, didn't shift in her seat. Her face gave them absolutely nothing to work with, which, as it turned out, made things worse. The lance corporal turned toward her more directly now. He asked her what she was doing on base, not politely. The question had an edge to it, the unspoken version underneath it being, "You don't belong here, and we all know it." She looked at him for the first time. Calm eyes. No performance of calm, actual calm, the kind that lives in a person who has been in situations where getting rattled meant someone didn't come home. She told him she was visiting. 2 words delivered without apology or explanation. He smiled at his friends. One of them laughed. And then all 4 of them stood up and moved their trays to her table, not asking, just doing it, taking up the space around her the way people do when they want to make someone feel small, surrounded, outnumbered. It was a power move dressed up as casualness, and it had probably worked for them before. They had no idea what they had just walked into. Rachel set her coffee cup down slowly. She looked at each of them in turn, 1, 2, 3, 4, and something shifted in her expression, though if you had asked any of the 4 Marines to describe exactly what changed, none of them would have been able to put words to it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to the way a door looks right before it opens. 45 seconds later, not one of them was still sitting down. Nobody in the cafeteria was watching when it started. Everybody in the cafeteria was watching when it ended. The Lance Corporal, his name was Danny Reyes, 22 years old, 6 feet tall, recently completed an infantry qualification that had made him feel, as he later described it, completely untouchable, leaned in across the table and told Rachel she should probably finish her food and get moving. He said it with a smile. That was the part that was supposed to sting most. The smile, the casual dismissal, the implication that she wasn't worth the energy of actual hostility. What happened next took most observers in the room about 3 full seconds to understand they were even watching. Rachel put her phone face down on the table. She looked at Reyes without blinking. She asked him, in a voice that was completely level, if he was sure he wanted to keep going. Not as a threat, not dramatically. The same tone someone might use to ask if you're sure you want to take that highway when there's a faster route available. Reyes interpreted it as nervousness. His friends interpreted it the same way. One of them, a corporal named Harris who was sitting to Rachel's left, reached over and tapped the edge of her tray toward her in a gesture that was meant to communicate that she was being dismissed. That was the mistake. The contact with her tray was the only physical provocation. That was all it took. What followed was not a fight in any traditional sense of the word. A fight implies 2 sides exchanging offense and defense in some roughly equal way. What happened at that cafeteria table was something closer to a demonstration. Rachel moved first, standing and stepping back from the table in one fluid motion that created space behind her while simultaneously turning her body sideways. It took less than a second. In that same moment, her left hand came up and redirected Harris's extended arm, not hard, not violently, just enough to take his balance slightly forward so that he had to catch himself on the table edge. It was a small movement, precise, completely controlled, and it left him momentarily off balance and confused without actually hurting him. Ray stood up fast, the way someone does when they realize something has shifted. He was big and he had the instinct to use that. He moved toward her. She didn't move away. She stepped inside his reach, which was the last thing he expected, and with one hand on his forearm and one at his shoulder, she redirected his own forward momentum in a direction he hadn't planned on going, which ended with his chest pressed flat against the edge of the table, both arms behind his back, held there by a grip that was not painful but was also absolutely, completely immovable. He tried to pull free twice. He stopped trying after the second attempt because he understood, with the very immediate certainty of someone who has trained in close combat, that this grip was not going to give. The third Marine had come around the side of the table and stopped completely when he saw the position Reyes was in. He froze. That was an intelligent decision. The fourth Marine, the youngest of the group, a private first class named Elliot who had the least bravado and the most actual situational awareness, had not moved at all. He was sitting very still, and his eyes had gone wide, and he was watching Rachel the way you watch something when you suddenly understand that your original assessment of what it was entirely wrong. Rachel released Reyes. She didn't push him, didn't make a show of it, just let go, stepped back and stood where she was. Her breathing was unchanged. Her hoodie was not even slightly out of place. Her coffee, still on the table, had not spilled. Ray straightened up slowly. He turned around. The expression on his face was not anger anymore. It was something more complicated than that, something that lived in the space between confusion and the first uncomfortable arrival of respect. The cafeteria had gone quiet in the specific way that places go quiet when enough people realize something remarkable is happening. About a dozen other service members at nearby tables had turned. Nobody spoke. Somebody's fork was held halfway to their mouth and had been there for the last 30 seconds. Harris was standing by the table rubbing his wrist, not because it hurt but because his nervous system needed something to do. He was staring at Rachel. He had been in 3 bar fights and 1 actual combat engagement, and he had never been neutralized so efficiently and so quietly in his life. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what branch she served. He didn't know what she was doing on this base. But he knew, with a certainty that sat in his chest like a stone, that he had just made a very significant miscalculation about who this woman was. Rachel picked up her coffee. She took a sip. She looked at the 4 of them one more time. She asked if they wanted to sit down and finish their lunch. Ray said yes. So did the others. They sat down, not because they had to, because something had changed in the air of that table, something that none of them could name exactly, but all of them felt completely. The way the atmosphere of a room changes when a window opens and the wind comes through, and suddenly everything smells different and the temperature drops 2 degrees and you know, without anyone telling you, that the weather has shifted. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute. Then Elliot, the youngest, the one who had gone still, looked at Rachel and asked her quietly who she was. She didn't answer right away. She finished her coffee first. Then she set the cup down and looked at him with the same calm eyes she had turned on all of them at the beginning, and she told him her name and her rank and her unit designation in a voice that was so matter-of-fact, so completely without drama, that it took 3 full seconds for the words to reach all 4 of them in the way they needed to. Lieutenant Commander, Navy SEAL. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. The walk from the Bud S. grinder to the day she pinned on her trident had taken Rachel Voss 4 years, 2 stress fractures, 1 dislocated shoulder, and a moment at 2:47 in the morning during Hell Week when she made a decision that changed the entire direction of her life. She hadn't planned to be a Navy SEAL. She had planned to be a Navy diver, a different track, still demanding, still rigorous, but not the same mountain. The shift happened during her first year at the Naval Academy, in a combatives class, when an instructor who had 2 combat deployments and no patience for people who weren't paying attention stopped in the middle of a demonstration, looked directly at her, and told her she was wasting herself. He didn't mean it as a compliment. It landed as one anyway. Rachel had grown up in a small town in southern Ohio, the middle child of 3, raised by a mother who worked as a paramedic and a father who repaired industrial machinery. Neither of her parents had military backgrounds. Her older brother had been the one expected to join. He was bigger, louder, more obvious about the way he took up space. Rachel had always been the quiet one, the one who finished her homework before anyone asked. The one who ran 5 miles before school not because anyone told her to, but because she found that the inside of her head was more organized after she did. She had an almost allergic reaction to being told what she was or wasn't capable of, which was a trait she inherited from her mother, who had once carried a man twice her size out of a burning vehicle on a highway in December. The academy refined everything she already was. The structure didn't break her down the way it was designed to break people down, because she arrived already disciplined in a way that ran deeper than rules. She trained harder than she needed to. She studied tactics the way other people read novels, not for assignments but because she was genuinely absorbed by the architecture of how things worked, how force was applied, where the weaknesses in a system lived. She became fluent in 2 additional languages. She qualified on every weapon system her program allowed. When the opportunity came to apply for an experimental integration program that placed women candidates in Bud-S alongside male candidates, Rachel put her name in within 24 hours. She didn't discuss it with anyone. She didn't ask for opinions. She completed the paperwork, submitted her physical assessments, and reported on the first day of first phase the same way she reported to everything. Early, without ceremony, ready to work. Hell Week arrived on a Wednesday. By Friday night, 6 of the 7 women who had started alongside her had dropped. Not because they lacked ability, because the combination of sleep deprivation, cold water, constant physical stress, and the specific psychological pressure of knowing that everyone around you is waiting for you to fail creates a weight that has nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with what you believe about yourself in the darkest, quietest, most honest part of your mind. Rachel did not believe she would fail. Not because she had certainty, she had doubt, plenty of it, the way anyone does when they are standing in 50-degree surf at 3 in the morning, while an instructor shouts questions about whether they want to ring the bell that ends everything. She had doubt, but beneath the doubt there was something harder and quieter, something that had been there since the highway in December when she was 12 years old and watched her mother make a choice that other people would have called impossible. Beneath the doubt there was the understanding that the impossible is mostly a story people tell themselves before they try. She finished Hell Week ranked 2nd in her class. After Bud-S, after qualification, after her first deployment, people sometimes asked Rachel what it was like to be one of the first women in that role. She understood why they asked. She found the question slightly beside the point. Being a woman in the SEALs had not been the challenge. The challenge had been the same thing it was for everyone, becoming someone who could actually do the job. The conversations about her gender had lived mostly in other people's heads. In the field, in the water, in the dark of an extraction window with a 30-second margin for error, nobody was thinking about what she was. They were thinking about whether she was ready. And she was always, without exception, ready. What she had never been able to fully prepare for was the moments in between, the cafeterias, the hallways, the meeting rooms where she walked in civilian clothes, and people formed conclusions in the first 3 seconds of looking at her. She had learned to treat those moments as information rather than insults. They told her something useful about the people in them, and occasionally, like today, they gave her an opportunity to deliver a lesson that no classroom could replicate. She didn't enjoy those moments. That was the part people always got wrong when she told the story later. They assumed there was satisfaction in it, the proving of a point, the reversal of expectations. There wasn't, or not much. What she felt was closer to something tired, the particular fatigue that comes from having to demonstrate your value in a room that should already know it. But she did it when she had to. Cleanly, efficiently, without wasted motion, the same way she did everything else. Back at the table, the 4 Marines were quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, something more thoughtful than that. Ray's had his hands wrapped around his water cup, turning it slowly on the tabletop. Harris was looking at the cafeteria wall with an expression that suggested a significant amount of recalibration was happening inside his skull. Elliot asked her something that none of the others had thought to ask. He said, did she think they could do it? Not as flattery, not as deflection. As a genuine question, asked in a tone that was humble in a way that surprised her. She looked at him for a moment, then she told him the most honest thing she could. She said that whether or not they could do it had nothing to do with her opinion. It had to do with what they found in themselves when everything easy had been taken away. And that was something she couldn't see from the outside. Nobody could. Elliot nodded slowly. He wrote something in a small notebook he pulled from his pocket. She didn't ask what it was. What began as a confrontation had turned into something nobody at the table had a name for. It wasn't exactly a mentorship session. It wasn't an apology tour. It was something rarer, a conversation between 5 people in a military cafeteria who had all, within the space of an hour, decided to be honest with each other. Ray spoke first after a long silence. He didn't apologize the way people apologize when they want to end an uncomfortable moment and move on. He looked at the table for a second, then looked at Rachel, and said that he had been wrong about her and that he knew why he had been wrong and that the reason wasn't something he was proud of. He said it flat and plain, without dressing it up or hedging it. It was the kind of honesty that cost something to give, and Rachel heard it for what it was. She told him she'd had the same thing happen dozens of times and that she had stopped expecting different. Not because she thought people couldn't change, but because she understood the system that produced the assumption. Men in his world, in her world, technically, were trained to sort by signals. Uniform, rank, bearing, size. When someone walked in without the expected signals, the system defaulted to a kind of hierarchy by appearance that had nothing to do with capability. It wasn't stupidity. It was pattern matching that had simply never been updated. Reyes listened to this without interrupting. That was the first thing she noticed that made her recalibrate him. He didn't try to fill the silence or soften what she was saying. He just let it land. Harris, who had been quiet since the moment she'd redirected his arm, asked her a direct question. He wanted to know how long it took, realistically, to get to that level of control. Not the training timeline, the interior thing. The place where a person could be surrounded by 4 people in a confrontational situation and not feel the spike of anxiety that leads to bad decisions. Rachel thought about that seriously before answering. She told him she wasn't sure it was something that arrived at a fixed point. It was more like a shift in relationship, not with other people, but with the idea of danger itself. Early in training, she had responded to threat with adrenaline that she had to manage, consciously override, talk herself through. After enough repetition, enough real exposure, the chemistry changed. The adrenaline was still there, but it was no longer the loudest voice. Clarity became louder than fear. And once that happened, once clarity was the first response instead of panic, everything else followed from it. Harris wrote nothing down, but he repeated the phrase quietly to himself. Clarity becomes louder than fear, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested it had landed somewhere important. The conversation drifted, the way conversations do when the pressure has been released and people start actually talking rather than performing. Reyes told her about his unit, about a deployment to a forward operating base in a location he didn't name, about a night that had gone wrong in a way that still woke him up sometimes at angles he hadn't expected. He told it without self-pity, the way military people often tell the difficult stories, matter-of-factly, with the specifics of logistics and timing and weather that are actually a way of not having to look directly at the emotional center of the thing, while still getting it out into the room. Rachel listened. She didn't offer a competing story. She asked 2 or 3 questions that were the right questions, not therapeutic questions, not the kind that press for feeling and vulnerability, but operational questions. What had the entry protocol been? Who had the left flank? What would he have done differently with 30 more seconds of preparation time? The questions shifted the conversation from grief to craft, and she could see Reyes respond to that. His shoulders came down slightly. His voice steadied. The story stopped being a wound and became a lesson he had learned. That was something she had picked up from a commanding officer she had served under in her second deployment, a man named Commander Walcott, who was arguably the most psychologically intelligent person she had ever worked with. Walcott had a theory that the most damaging thing you could do for a soldier processing a traumatic event was to treat the event primarily as a source of feeling rather than a source of information. Feeling needed to be acknowledged. He was clear about that. But parking the conversation there, making it circle around pain without resolution, left people stuck. Asking operational questions, even about things that had gone wrong, turned the experience into something the person could analyze, learn from, integrate. It moved them from subject to student. And most people, given the choice, found the student role far more comfortable than the subject role. She didn't explain any of this to Reyes. She just did it, and it worked the way it always worked. The 4th Marine, the one who had frozen at the side of the table, a corporal named Mendez who had barely spoken, finally said something. He said he had a sister, that she wanted to join the military, that their family was not supportive of the idea and he had been one of the people discouraging her. He said it with the specific discomfort of someone who has just realized that a position they held was wrong before they had said it out loud, and that saying it out loud was the moment of realization. Rachel looked at him for a moment. She asked how old his sister was. 19. She asked what branch his sister was interested in. He said she hadn't decided. She was interested in everything. Rachel told him that was a good sign. She told him that the worst thing a person could bring to a military selection process was certainty, the kind of certainty that said I'm here for this one specific thing, because certainty was brittle. What lasted was adaptability. Interest in everything was the beginning of adaptability. She didn't tell him to encourage his sister. She didn't make a speech about opportunity or equality. She just gave him the honest operational assessment, the same way she would give it to anyone. And the way Mendez looked when she finished, slightly stunned, nodding slowly, as though something that had been turned the wrong way in his mind had just been turned the right way, told her that it had done more good than any speech would have. Outside the cafeteria windows, the afternoon light had gone long and orange, the particular light of early evening on a military base that always had a slightly suspended quality, time moving normally and strangely at once. Rachel's tray was empty. The apple she hadn't planned to eat was half gone. The coffee cup had been refilled twice by a mess hall worker who had been clearly eavesdropping on the table and did not seem embarrassed about it. She looked at her watch. She had a few hours before she needed to sleep. Her flight was early. There was nothing left to do today that required her to be anywhere but here. She stayed at the table. She was gone by 5:30 the next morning. The base was still dark when the car came for her, and the cafeteria was empty, and the only people moving through the corridors were the early shift staff and two runners who didn't break stride as she passed. She had her bag on one shoulder and her coffee, the same black, no sugar, nothing extra, in her other hand. And she walked to the waiting car with the same unhurried economy of motion that she brought to everything, the walk of someone who understood that speed and urgency were not the same thing. She didn't leave a note. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. That wasn't how her world worked. People arrived and departed, and what they left behind wasn't messages or gestures. It was something that lived in the people who had been in the room. Reyes found out she was gone when he came into the cafeteria for morning chow, and the corner table was empty. He stood in the food line with his tray and looked at the table for a moment, then found his usual seat with his unit. He didn't say much over breakfast. The men in his unit noticed he was quieter than normal and made the reasonable military assumption that he was hungover or tired. He wasn't either. He was thinking about the thing Rachel had said about pattern matching, about the way the brain sorts people by signals and how that sorting, left unchallenged, becomes a wall between a person and what is actually in front of them. He was thinking about how many times he had let that wall stay up without examining it. He was thinking that it had cost him things he hadn't even known he was losing. He applied to officer candidate school 7 months later. He cited the cafeteria conversation in his personal statement without nomming Rachel directly, because she had asked him not to, during that last stretch of the evening when the conversation had finally gone quiet, and she had said plainly that she wasn't a story to put in a file. She was a person who had a job to do. He described it instead as a moment of recalibration that changed his understanding of what leadership actually required. He was accepted on his first application. Harris went a different direction. He transferred to a special operations support role 18 months after that Tuesday afternoon, drawn specifically to the operational architecture that Rachel had described, the preparation, the redundancy, the way a well-designed mission had failure points built into the plan, not because failure was expected, but because it was honest. He had always been technically gifted. He had never been intellectually curious about his own craft until that day. The question she had turned back on him, where does control actually lie, had opened something that he spent the next several years trying to fully understand. He didn't become a SEAL. He became something adjacent to it, less visible, and in his assessment more suited to who he actually was. He was good at it in a way he hadn't been good at things before, because for the first time he was working from a place of genuine understanding rather than performance. Mendez called his sister the same night Rachel left. It was late and she was doing homework, and she picked up surprised because they didn't usually talk on weeknights. He told her that he had met someone that day who made him reconsider some things, and that he wanted to say that if the military was what she wanted, she should pursue it seriously, and that he would support her. His sister was quiet for long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then she told him that she had already submitted her initial application paperwork 2 weeks ago, and hadn't told the family yet, because she expected the response she had been getting. He laughed, she laughed. It was the best conversation they'd had in 2 years. Elliot, the youngest, the one who had gone still, the one with the notebook, took the longest. He carried the conversation around with him the way certain people carry things, quietly, always present with it, taking it out and examining it from different angles at different times. He was 20 years old and had grown up with the assumption that the world was already sorted into categories: who was strong, who wasn't, who had it and who didn't, and that those categories were mostly visible from the outside if you looked right. That afternoon had done something to that assumption, not broken it cleanly, something more complicated. He was still thinking about the way Rachel had sat completely alone in a corner, and still managed to be the most formidable person in the room without trying to be, without needing the room to know it. He thought about that for a long time. 3 years later, Elliot began the process to apply for MARSOC, Marine Corps Special Operations Command. In his assessment interviews, he was asked to identify a moment that changed the direction of his thinking. He described a Tuesday lunch at Camp Pendleton. He described a woman in a gray hoodie. He described 45 seconds and what they cost him and what they gave him. The interviewer asked what specifically it gave him. Elliot said it gave him a more accurate understanding of the difference between looking powerful and being powerful, and that the two things had almost nothing to do with each other. He passed the assessment. Rachel, meanwhile, caught her flight at 6:15 and was in a different time zone by noon. She had another debrief in the afternoon and a planning session in the evening, and approximately 6 hours of sleep scheduled between now and the next operational window. She thought about the 4 Marines once, briefly, somewhere over the Arizona desert when the coffee ran out and the cabin went quiet, and there was nothing to do but look out the window at the brown and tan of the landscape far below. She hoped they were okay. She hoped the conversation had done something good. She had no way of knowing, and that was fine. You planted things in people sometimes, and you walked away, and you trusted that either the soil was right or it wasn't, and either way you had done what you could. The person you were in a room mattered. The rank on your chest was a number. The thing behind your eyes, the thing that didn't flinch, didn't perform, didn't need the room to understand it before it moved, that was the credential. That was the thing that could not be faked and could not be taken and did not require anyone's recognition to exist. She had known that since she was 12 years old, watching her mother on a highway in December. She had never once forgotten it. The plane leveled out above the clouds. She closed her eyes. She had work to do when she landed, and she was already thinking about it, already 3 steps into the planning, already building the map of what came next. She was ready, she was always ready, that part never changed.